At my own family's dinner, my daughter-in-law snapped her fingers at the restaurant staff, pointed at me, and said, "Get this pauper away from our table. He's embarrassing us." She had no idea that the restaurant she was sitting in, the company she worked for, and a great deal more, besides, all belonged to me. I was sitting at a table in one of the finest restaurants in the city, a restaurant I happened to own, though almost no one knew it, wearing an old, comfortable jacket, the kind of thing a man my age wears when he's stopped needing to impress anyone. And my son's wife, Bianca, dressed to the nines and desperate to look like she belonged in a place like that, took one look at her plainly dressed father-in-law and decided I was a stain on her image. And she snapped her fingers, actually snapped her fingers the way you'd summon a dog, at a young waiter passing by, and she said, loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear, "Excuse me, can you have someone escort this man out? He clearly wandered in from the street. He's a pauper, and he's embarrassing us. This is a respectable establishment." The young waiter's face went white, because the young waiter, unlike my daughter-in-law, knew exactly who I was. And I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't rage, though I think most men would have felt rage. What I felt, underneath a deep and quiet sadness, was a kind of clarity. Because in that one moment, snapping her fingers and calling me a pauper in front of a room full of people, my daughter-in-law showed all of us, exactly who she really was. The mask came off. And once a mask like that comes off, you can never quite put it back on. Now I want to be very clear about something before I tell you the rest of this story, because it matters, and because it's the thing that separates what actually happened from the kind of ugly revenge fantasy you might be expecting. I did not, the next day, pick up the phone and vengefully order someone to punish her. That's not what happened, and I want to tell you honestly that it's not who I am. And more importantly, it's not what justice actually looked like here. What happened was both better and more fitting than that, because my daughter-in-law, that night, set in motion her own downfall, entirely by her own hand, and all I had to do was let the truth come out and let the consequences of her own cruelty find her. She dug the hole. She jumped in. I didn't push her, I didn't need to, but I'm getting ahead of myself, and none of this means what it needs to mean unless I tell it in order, because you need to understand who I am, and who Bianca is, and how a woman comes to snap her fingers at her own husband's father and call him a pauper, and what happened when the whole room found out the truth. And I promise you, it is not quite what you think, and the part that matters most to me has nothing to do with the company at all. So, stay with me, and if you have ever been looked down on, dismissed, treated as beneath someone's notice by a person who had absolutely no idea who they were really talking to, reach down and hit that subscribe button right now, because this is a story about a man who was called a pauper at his own family's table, and about what his daughter-in-law discovered far too late, about the man she just tried to have thrown into the street. Let me back up. My name is Ellis Thornbury. I'm 65 years old now, and all of this happened last year when I was 64, and I've had a year to sit with it and to watch how it all played out, and I'm going to tell it to you straight. Let me tell you who I am, because my daughter-in-law's entire catastrophe was built on the fact that she had decided, without ever bothering to check, that I was nobody. I grew up with nothing. Real nothing, a poor childhood, a hard start, the kind of upbringing where you learn that the world sorts people into those who have and those who don't, and you'd better claw your way toward having, or you'll spend your life being stepped over. And I clawed. I had a head for business, for building, for the slow, unglamorous work of turning a small thing into a bigger thing, and a bigger thing into something substantial. And over about 40 years, starting with a single small business and reinvesting every dollar, I built what can honestly be called an empire. Not a flashy one, a quiet one, but a real one. I own companies. A number of them, across several industries, hospitality, retail, property, services. I own restaurants, including some of the best in this city. I own the parent company of a mid-sized firm where, as it happens, my daughter-in-law works. I am, by any measure, a wealthy and powerful man, and almost nobody knows it, and that is entirely by design, and it's the whole engine of this story. Because here is a thing I learned very early, and it has served me my entire life. The moment people know you have money and power, you stop seeing who they really are. They perform for you. They flatter you, defer to you, package themselves for your approval. You lose the ability to see people honestly, because everyone around you is wearing their best face. So I made a decision, decades ago, to keep my wealth quiet, to dress plainly, to live below what I could afford, to move through the world looking like an ordinary, modest man of no particular importance, because when people think you're nobody, they show you exactly who they are. The kind ones are kind to you anyway. The cruel ones let you see their cruelty, and you learn very quickly whom you can trust. I've watched people be rude to waiters and gentle to CEOs, and learned everything I needed to know about them. I've watched people ignore the unimportant old man in the corner and then turn on the charm for someone they thought mattered. My plain jacket is the finest character test ever devised, and it has never, in 40 years, told me a lie. Let me give you one example, because it shows you how well it works and why I trust it. Years ago, I was considering promoting one of two men to run one of my companies, both talented, both qualified, and I couldn't decide between them on paper. So I did what I always do. I showed up at a work event dressed as a plain, forgettable old man, introduced as a low-level consultant of no importance, and I watched. And one of those two men was courteous to me, but clearly saw no reason to spend time on an unimportant old consultant, and drifted off to network with people who mattered. And the other man sat with me for half an hour, genuinely interested, asking about my life, treating me, a nobody, as far as he knew, with real warmth and respect, purely because that's how he treated people. He had no idea I was the owner. He had no reason to impress me. He was just kind. I promoted the kind one. And he turned out to be one of the finest leaders I ever hired, because a man who is decent to people who can't help him is a man who can be trusted with power over people who can't fight back. That's the whole secret. Character isn't how you treat people who can do something for you. Anyone can be charming to the boss. Character is how you treat the people who can do nothing for you at all. And the plain jacket lets me see it every time. Bianca failed that test in the most spectacular way a person can fail it. But she'd been failing it quietly for years, and I'd been watching. Remember that, because it's the key to everything. When Bianca looked at me and saw a pauper, she wasn't being fooled by a disguise. She was showing me her soul. Let me tell you about my son Declan, because he's the reason this story hurts the way it does, and he's the heart of it. Declan is my only child. He's 34 years old, and I love him more than my own life, and he is, I'll say it plainly, a good man, a kind man, a gentle man, and in some ways too trusting a man, which is how he ended up married to Bianca. I raised Declan very deliberately not to be spoiled. Even though I had the means to give him anything, I didn't. He didn't grow up knowing the family was wealthy. I kept it from him too, mostly, the same way I kept it from everyone, letting him think we were comfortable but ordinary. I wanted him to become a good person on his own merits, to learn the value of work and of people, not to grow up as a rich man's son surrounded by flatterers. And it worked. Declan is decent and hardworking and humble, and he has no idea, still doesn't fully grasp even now, the scale of what his father actually built. He knew I did well in business. He had no idea I owned the company his own wife worked for. I never told him. It never came up because I don't talk about it, because talking about it defeats the entire purpose. I want to tell you a little about how I built what I built, because it explains why I hold it so lightly. I started with a single small shop, a modest little business barely scraping by, that I bought with borrowed money and a great deal of nerve when I was young. And I worked it. 16-hour days, no vacations, reinvesting every penny that came in instead of spending it on myself. And when that one was solid, I bought another, and another. I learned that the secret to building real wealth isn't luck or genius. It's patience and discipline, and the willingness to delay every reward. Most people, the moment they have a little money, spend it on things that make them look successful. I did the opposite. Every dollar I could have spent on looking rich, I invested in actually becoming rich instead. And over 40 years, that compounds into something enormous. But here's what that long climb taught me, the thing that matters. I remember being nobody. I remember being the young man that established people looked straight through, the one who didn't matter, the one who was beneath their notice. I know exactly what it feels like to be treated as a pauper, because for many years I was treated as one when I actually was one. And I made a promise to myself, somewhere along the way, that no matter how high I climbed, I would never become one of those people who look through the nobody in the corner. I would never forget what it felt like to be him. And keeping my wealth quiet, dressing plain, staying ordinary, that's part of how I keep that promise. It keeps me close to the man I was, so I never become the kind of man who snaps his fingers at a waiter. Which is precisely the kind of person my daughter-in-law had become. And that ordinary, humble upbringing is exactly why Declan never thought to mention to Bianca that his father was anything more than a modest, retired businessman. Because as far as Declan knew, that's all I was. Let me tell you about Bianca. Declan met Bianca about 5 years ago and married her about 4 years ago, and I want to be fair, so I'll tell you that in the beginning, she seemed fine. Pleasant enough. Ambitious, which isn't a sin. She had a good job at a company, the company I happened to own the parent of, though she never knew that, and neither did Declan. And she was climbing, and she cared a great deal about status, about appearances, about being seen as someone important and successful and refined. And over the 4 years of their marriage, I watched that care about status curdle into something uglier. Because Bianca, I came to understand, was one of those people whose entire sense of self is built on looking down. She needed there to be people beneath her. She measured her own worth by how many people she could feel superior to, and she treated people accordingly, gracious and fawning to anyone she thought was above her, and dismissive, cold, even cruel to anyone she thought was below her. Waiters, assistants, cleaners, and, increasingly, me, because she had decided, based on my plain clothes and my modest lifestyle and my refusal to flaunt anything, that her father-in-law was a low-status nobody, a poor relation, an embarrassment to be tolerated and, ideally, hidden. She wasn't openly hostile to me, not at first. It was small things, a slight coolness, a way of not quite introducing me to her important friends, a subtle embarrassment about the plain old man Declan had for a father. Once, early on, she asked Declan, not knowing I could hear, whether I might dress a little better for an event she was hosting, because her colleagues would be there and she didn't want them to get the wrong impression. Declan, bless him, told her his father dressed however his father liked, and that was that. But I saw it. I saw exactly what she thought of me and exactly what kind of person measures a man by his jacket. There was another moment, about 2 years into their marriage, that I've thought about often since. We were all at a large family gathering, and Bianca was holding court, telling a story to a group of people about a woman at her office, an older cleaning lady, as it happened, whom Bianca was mocking, imitating her accent, describing her as basically furniture, laughing about how she'd put this woman in her place for some tiny infraction. And the group around her laughed along, the way people do, and I stood at the edge of it, the unimportant old father-in-law, and I watched my daughter-in-law entertain a room by demeaning a powerless woman who wasn't there, to defend herself, and I felt something cold settle in my chest. Because I've learned that the way a person talks about the powerless when they think it's safe, when they think everyone in the room is on their level and no one who matters is listening, is the truest window into their soul there is. And Bianca, thinking she was among equals, thinking the plain old man at the edge of the room didn't count, showed me her soul that day. She thought a cleaning lady was furniture. She thought cruelty was entertainment. And I understood, watching her, that this was not a woman having a bad moment. This was a woman revealing her nature. I said nothing. It wasn't the time, and Declan was happy, and I was still waiting, as I always wait for a person like that to show everyone what they'd already shown me. But I never forgot it. And when she snapped her fingers at me in that restaurant, I wasn't surprised. I'd seen it coming for 2 years. I'd just been waiting for the rest of the world, and my son, to see it too. And I said nothing for years, for Declan's sake. Because he loved her, or loved who he thought she was, and it would have broken his heart to hear his father say what his father could see plainly, that he'd married a woman who valued people by their price tag, and who would turn on anyone the moment they stopped being useful to her image. But I want to tell you the most important thing, the thing that made me hold my tongue all those years. It wasn't weakness. I was waiting, not scheming, waiting. because I have lived long enough to know that people like Bianca always, always expose themselves eventually. Cruelty that's kept on a leash slips the leash sooner or later. You don't have to do anything to a person like that except give them enough rope and enough time. And I trusted, correctly, as it turned out, that if I simply remained who I was, plainly dressed and quietly watchful, Bianca would eventually show everyone, including my son, exactly who she was. I just had to be patient. And I was. Which brings us to the dinner. It was a family dinner. My wife Marin's birthday, actually, which matters, because it makes what Bianca did even worse. My wife, Declan's mother, a warm and gracious woman who has put up with my plain jackets for 40 years and loves me anyway, wanted a nice family dinner for her birthday. And I chose the restaurant, one of the best in the city, and though no one at the table except me knew it, one that I owned. I want you to picture the scene. My wife Marin, radiant, happy it was her birthday, surrounded by family. My son Declan, happy to see his mother happy. Me, in my comfortable old jacket, delighted to treat my wife to a beautiful evening. And Bianca, dressed expensively, thrilled to be seen in such a prestigious establishment, treating the whole thing as a stage for her own importance. And from the moment we sat down, Bianca was in her element and at her worst. She was imperious with the staff, snapping orders, complaining, making a show of how discerning and important she was. She name-dropped. She spoke loudly about her career, her success, her rising status, and she was, throughout, visibly embarrassed by me, her plainly dressed father-in-law, sitting there in his old jacket in this temple of refinement. I could see it eating at her. I could see her wishing I wasn't there, wishing the staff and the other diners wouldn't associate her with this shabby old man. And then it happened. Let me slow down here, because this moment matters, and I want you to see it exactly as it unfolded. The evening had been tense from the start, with Bianca performing importance and being visibly ashamed of me, but it was still, technically, a pleasant family dinner. Marin was glowing. The food was extraordinary, as it should be in that kitchen. And then a young waiter, a good kid, nervous, clearly new to the job, the kind of eager young person just starting out that I always have a soft spot for because I was once exactly that, made a small error with Bianca's order, brought her the wrong wine, I think it was, or poured the wrong vintage. An honest, tiny, completely forgivable mistake, the kind that happens 100 times a night in every restaurant in the world. And Bianca went off. And I mean she went off in a way that was completely out of proportion to a wrong glass of wine. Because I understood even then, it was never about the wine. It was about Bianca needing an audience for her own importance, needing to demonstrate to the whole room that she was the kind of discerning, powerful person who would not tolerate incompetence from the help. The wine was just her excuse to perform superiority. She laid into this poor young man publicly, viciously, telling him he was incompetent, that she couldn't believe the standards had fallen so low, that she would be speaking to management about him, that he'd be lucky to keep his job. And this kid, this nervous, decent kid, went pale and started stammering apologies, mortified, shrinking under the assault of a woman determined to destroy him over a glass of wine to make herself feel large. The whole table went quiet with embarrassment. Marin looked stricken. Declan started to say, "Bianca, please, it's fine." And I did what I always do when I see someone with power abusing someone without it. I said gently, "It's all right, son. It was an honest mistake. No harm done. Why don't you bring her a fresh glass and we'll say no more about it?" I was speaking to the waiter, kindly, trying to diffuse it, and Bianca rounded on me. And this is the moment. This is the moment the mask came off in front of everyone. She looked at me, her husband's father, at her mother-in-law's birthday dinner, and her face twisted with contempt, and she snapped her fingers at another passing staff member, and she said loudly, "You know what? I've had enough of this. Can someone please get this pauper away from our table? He's clearly senile, he's embarrassing all of us, and I don't know why we have to bring him to nice places. Have security escort him out. Now. Get this pauper away from our table. Have security escort him out." To her husband's father, at her mother-in-law's birthday dinner, in a restaurant I owned. And the whole room heard it. The neighboring tables, the staff. My wife, whose birthday it was, sat there with tears starting in her eyes. And my son Declan, my gentle, good son, sat frozen, staring at his wife, as though seeing her clearly for the very first time. And the staff member Bianca had snapped at did not move to escort me anywhere. Instead, this staff member looked at Bianca, and then looked at me with an expression of pure horror and apology, and hurried away, not to get security, but, as I would learn, to get the manager, because the staff of that restaurant knew exactly who the plainly dressed old man at the birthday table was, and they were mortified. Now, here's where I have to tell you what I did, because it's the whole point, and it's the thing I'm proudest of. I did not explode. I did not announce in a thunderous voice, "Do you know who I am?" Though I could have, and though part of me wanted to. I did not have her thrown out, or humiliated on the spot, or dragged before the room. Because that would have made a scene at my wife's birthday, and because stooping to spectacle is beneath the dignity I've spent a lifetime building, and because, and this is the important part, I didn't need to do anything. Bianca had already done it all to herself. The damage was done, and it was entirely her own. I simply looked at her calmly, with a sadness I didn't try to hide, and I said quietly, "Bianca, I'm not going anywhere. This is my wife's birthday, and I intend to stay and enjoy it. But I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember exactly what you just said, and to whom, and in front of whom, because I have a feeling you're going to think about it a great deal in the days to come." She had no idea what I meant. She thought it was the toothless warning of a senile old pauper. She actually rolled her eyes, and I remember, in that exact moment, her eyes rolling, her contempt total, absolutely certain she was dealing with a harmless, powerless old fool, feeling a strange calm wash over me. Not anger, not the desire for revenge. Just the quiet certainty of a man who has seen this pattern play out many times over a long life, and knows exactly how it ends. I have watched arrogance meet its reckoning again and again across 64 years, and it always follows the same arc. The certainty, the contempt, the fatal miscalculation, and then the slow, dawning horror, as the ground the arrogant person thought was solid turns out to be air. Bianca was at the very beginning of that arc, rolling her eyes at me, and I could see the whole rest of it stretching out ahead of her, invisible to her, inevitable. She thought she was looking at a defeated old man. She was actually looking at the one person in that room who understood precisely what was about to happen to her, and who felt, beneath his sadness for his son, something almost like pity. Almost. And then the manager arrived at the table, hurrying, ashen-faced, and did the thing that began to unravel everything. Because the manager came directly to me and bowed slightly and said, with enormous deference and worry, "Mr. Thornberry, sir, I am so deeply sorry. Is everything all right? Is there anything at all we can do for you? Please, sir, anything you need. Mr. Thornberry, sir." And I watched my daughter-in-law's face begin to change. Because you don't address a wandering pauper as Mr. Thornberry, sir. You don't have the manager of one of the finest restaurants in the city rush to a shabby old man's side, bowing, desperate to please him, calling him sir. Something was wrong with Bianca's picture of the world, and she was just beginning to sense it. And I said to the manager kindly, "Everything's fine, thank you. It's my wife's birthday. We're going to have a lovely evening. Please don't trouble yourself." And I want to add one thing I said to the manager that night quietly, because it matters. I said, that young waiter who was serving us, he did nothing wrong. The mistake was trivial and he handled himself well. See that he knows he's in no trouble at all. I made a point of it in front of Bianca, because I wanted the contrast in the room, even if she couldn't absorb it. She had tried to destroy a young man over a glass of wine to feel important. I, the man she'd called a pauper, who actually owned the place and could have fired anyone in it with a word, used what power I had to protect the powerless kid instead of punishing him. That is the whole difference between real power and the desperate hunger to feel powerful. The truly powerful protect. The insecure abuse. Bianca showed the room which one she was. I quietly showed them which one I was. And that young waiter I looked out for afterward, saw that he was recognized and given a real chance, and last I heard he'd been promoted and was thriving. I mention it because it's the half of the story people forget, While the arrogant get their comeuppance, the kind and the overlooked quietly get their due as well. Both halves are justice. And the manager, still anxious, still deferential, backed away. But the damage to Bianca's illusion was done. She had watched the entire senior staff of this prestigious restaurant treat the pauper she'd tried to have thrown out as the most important person in the room. And I saw the first flicker of real fear cross her face. Not understanding yet, but sensing that she had made some terrible miscalculation. I did not enlighten her that night. I let her sit with it through the rest of the dinner, watching the staff treat me with quiet reverence, watching them ignore her imperious demands, and attend instantly to my slightest comfort, watching the whole hierarchy she thought she understood turn upside down before her eyes. I let her stew in a growing, formless dread, and I turned my attention to my wife, and I made sure Maren had a beautiful birthday despite it all, because that mattered more to me than Bianca's discomfort. And here I have to tell you about Maren, because 40 years with the right person teaches you what actually matters, and it isn't any of the things Bianca spent her life chasing. Maren married me when I truly had nothing, when I was that young man with one struggling little shop and borrowed money and enormous dreams, and no proof at all that any of it would work. She married the man, not the money, because there was no money to marry. She stood beside me through every lean year, every risk. Every night I came home exhausted and frightened that it might all collapse. And when the money did come, slowly, over decades, it never changed her, because she'd never been with me for it in the first place. Maren is the one who understood, better than I did, why I kept the wealth quiet. She used to tease me about the jacket, sure, but she knew. She'd say, "The people worth having are the ones who'd have loved you in the shop." And she was right. Everyone who's ever mattered in my life is someone who was good to me before they had any reason to be, who treated the plain man well, because that's simply who they were. Maren, Declan, a handful of true friends. And the cruelest irony of that whole birthday dinner is that Bianca, sitting there in her expensive clothes, trying so hard to look like she belonged among important people, was surrounded by the realest wealth in that room. A 40-year marriage built on love that had nothing to do with money. And she couldn't see it, because she'd never once in her life understood what was actually valuable. She was chasing the appearance of a thing that the plain old couple across the table actually had. But my son Declan, oh, my son. Declan spent that entire dinner staring at his wife as though a veil had been torn away, because Declan had just watched the woman he married snap her fingers and call his father a pauper and try to have him thrown into the street at his mother's birthday out of pure, status-obsessed cruelty. And no revelation about my wealth was needed for that. Declan didn't need to know I was rich to be horrified. He'd just seen his wife's true character, naked, in public, aimed at his own gentle father. And something broke in him that night that I don't think ever mended. Now, let me tell you what happened next, and how Bianca's own cruelty came home to roost, because this is the part where she got exactly what she deserved, and where I want to be very clear that she did it to herself. The truth came out, of course, in the days that followed. Declan, shaken, asked me quietly after the dinner what the manager had meant, why they'd treated me that way. And I told him the truth, not to brag, but because he was my son and he deserved to know. I told him that I owned that restaurant, and a good many other things besides. And, as gently as I could, I told him that among the things I owned was the parent company of the firm where Bianca worked, that his father, the pauper, was in fact the ultimate owner of his wife's employer. Declan was stunned into silence, and then he did the thing that told me everything about the difference between my son and his wife. His first reaction wasn't excitement about the money. It was shame. Shame at how his wife had treated a man who'd been nothing but kind, and grief, I think, at what it revealed about the person he'd married. The money meant nothing to him. The character meant everything. That's my boy. And I want to tell you about a conversation Declan and I had a few days after that, because it's one of the most important conversations of my life, and it tells you what this whole thing was really about. He came to see me alone, and he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "Dad, I keep replaying it. Her snapping her fingers at you, calling you a pauper, trying to have you thrown out at Mom's birthday." And he stopped, and his voice caught, and he said, And the thing that kills me is that I don't think she'd have done it any differently, even if you weren't secretly rich. She did it because she thought you were nobody. She thought you had no power and no status, and so in her mind you were disposable, and she treated you like garbage in front of a room full of people. And that's who I married. Not someone who made a mistake. Someone who genuinely believes that people without money or status don't deserve basic dignity. And I didn't say anything because he needed to arrive at it himself. And he did. He said, "I don't care that you own her company, Dad. I mean, it's unbelievable, and we'll talk about it." But that's not what's breaking my heart. What's breaking my heart is that I've spent 4 years married to someone I didn't actually know. Someone whose whole personality is built on looking down on people, and I only saw it clearly when she aimed it at you. And I put my hand on my son's shoulder, and I told him the truest thing I know. "Son, people always show you who they are eventually. The only question is whether you're willing to see it when they do. You saw it. That's not weakness. That's the beginning of getting your life back." Now, here is where Bianca's downfall unfolded, and here is where I have to be honest about my own role, because it matters. I did not call the company and vindictively order them to demote my daughter-in-law or make her a dishwasher out of spite. I want to be clear about that, because it's the difference between justice and abuse, and because it's simply not what happened. What happened is that Bianca's own conduct, her actual documented pattern of behavior, caught up with her, the way it always eventually does with people like her, and all I did was decline to protect her from the consequences of who she'd chosen to be. Here's what I mean. It turned out, and this came to light naturally once attention was on the situation, that Bianca's cruelty that night was not an aberration. It was a pattern. The way she'd treated that young waiter, the way she'd tried to have me thrown out, was exactly how Bianca treated people she considered beneath her, all the time, including at work. And it emerged that there had been complaints. Real ones. Bianca, it turned out, had a documented history at her company of exactly this kind of behavior, of berating and demeaning junior staff, assistant subordinates, anyone she thought couldn't touch her. People had reported it. It had been noted. But Bianca had been protected, to some degree, by her ambition and her polish and her skill at flattering the people above her, and nothing much had come of it. Until the parent company's owner, me, was made aware, along with everyone else, of exactly the kind of person she was, in the most public way imaginable. Now, I want to be precise about this because it's the moral heart of the whole thing. I did not manufacture consequences for Bianca. What I did was refuse to shield her from consequences she had already earned. When the company reviewed her conduct, as any company should when a manager has a documented pattern of abusing subordinates, I simply did not intervene to protect her, the way her flattery and polish had protected her before. I let the process take its natural course. And the natural course for a manager with a real, documented history of cruelty to subordinates, culminating in a spectacularly public display of exactly that character, was not good for Bianca. She was removed from her management position. The company, reviewing everything, determined that a person who treated people the way Bianca did had no business supervising anyone. She was stripped of her title, her authority, her status, the status that was the entire foundation of her sense of self, and she was demoted dramatically to an entry-level position with no power over anyone, doing the kind of humble work she had spent her whole life sneering at other people for doing. The woman who had snapped her fingers at waiters found herself, in effect, back at the very bottom she had spent her life terrified of returning to. And I want to tell you honestly, I did not lift a finger to make that happen beyond declining to prevent it. Her cruelty was documented before I ever knew the scale of it. Her downfall was authored entirely by her own behavior, over years, toward people she thought didn't matter. All I did was allow the truth of who she was to be seen, and allow the consequences she'd been dodging to finally land. She spent her career building a case against herself. I just stopped being the reason it never went anywhere because I hadn't even known, before that night, that she worked for me at all. That, to me, is justice. Not a vindictive old man abusing his power to crush a woman who insulted him, but a cruel person who had mistreated the powerless for years, finally being seen clearly and finally facing the consequences of her own documented behavior, with no one left willing to protect her from herself. She got exactly what she had earned by her own hand over a long time. The dinner was just the moment the whole world and her own husband finally saw the truth. Now, the honest, human rest of it, because these stories always want to end at the comeuppance, and life is longer and more complicated than that. Bianca's marriage to my son did not survive, and I want to be clear that I did not engineer that either, and in fact I stayed carefully out of it. But Declan, having seen his wife's true character laid bare, not the demotion, but the cruelty that caused it, the finger-snapping contempt aimed at his own father, could not unsee it. He tried, for a while, I think, out of loyalty and the investment of years. But something fundamental had shifted. He'd married a woman he thought was ambitious and refined, and he'd discovered she was cruel and hollow and obsessed with status to the point that she'd publicly degrade his own father to protect her image. You can't build a life on that once you've seen it. They separated within the year. And here's a thing I have to be fair about, because I don't want to paint Bianca as a cartoon. I've wondered, this past year, what made her that way. That desperate need to look down on people. That terror of being seen as low status. It comes from somewhere. Usually from a person who was themselves made to feel worthless at some point, and decided wrongly that the solution was to make sure others felt worthless instead. I don't excuse what she did, but I've come to pity it a little. She spent her whole life so afraid of being a pauper that she became cruel to anyone who reminded her of the possibility, and in the end, that very cruelty is what brought her all the way down to the bottom she feared. There's a terrible justice in that, but there's a sadness in it too. She was destroyed by the thing she was most afraid of, and she built that destruction herself, brick by brick, out of her own fear. And there's a lesson in that fear that I think is worth sitting with, because it's not just Bianca's lesson, it's a warning for all of us. The need to look down on others always comes from a hidden terror of being looked down on yourself. People who are secure in their own worth don't need anyone beneath them. They can be kind to everyone because their dignity doesn't depend on someone else's degradation. It's the insecure, the frightened, the ones who secretly suspect they're worthless, who need a constant supply of people to feel superior to. Every time Bianca demeaned a waiter or a cleaner or her plain father-in-law, she was trying to prove to herself that she wasn't at the bottom, and the very act of proving it was what revealed she'd never left the bottom in her own mind at all. Her cruelty wasn't strength. It was the loudest possible confession of weakness. The genuinely strong don't behave that way. They have nothing to prove, so they're free to be kind. As for me, I went back to my plain jacket and my quiet life, no richer and no poorer than before, because none of this was ever about money. And I want to tell you the part that actually matters to me, the part that has nothing to do with the company or the demotion or the comeuppance. What matters to me is that my son saw clearly. That's it. That's the whole prize. Declan is free now of a person who would have spent his life slowly diminishing him, embarrassing his father, measuring everyone by their price. He's himself again, the gentle, decent man I raised. He and I are closer than we've ever been, partly because the secret of who I am is finally out between us, and he's had to reckon with the fact that his humble father built quietly an empire and never once used it to lord over anyone. If anything, learning what I'd done, building all that and staying plain, testing people with my ordinary jacket, never flaunting a thing, taught Declan something about character that I could never have taught him with a lecture. He learned what real dignity looks like. Not the kind that snaps its fingers at waiters, but the kind that treats the powerless with kindness precisely because it has nothing to prove. And my wife Maren, whose birthday was so cruelly disrupted, Maren said something to me that night, after it was all over, that I've held on to. She said, "Ellis, you've been wearing that old jacket for 40 years, and I used to wish you'd dress up a little. But tonight I understood finally what the jacket is really for. It's not that you don't care how you look, it's that you'd rather know who people really are than be flattered by who they pretend to be. And tonight it showed us all the truth. I'll never ask you to change that jacket again." And she kissed my cheek, and we finished her birthday cake, just the family who actually loved each other, and it was, despite everything, one of the better nights of my life. Here's the thing I keep coming back to, and then I'll let you go. My daughter-in-law looked at a plainly dressed old man and saw a pauper, someone beneath her, someone to be dismissed and discarded and thrown into the street. And she was so certain of what she saw that she never once considered she might be wrong. And that certainty, that arrogant, contemptuous certainty that she could measure a person's whole worth by their jacket, was the exact thing that destroyed her. Because the pauper she snapped her fingers at owned the ground she was standing on, and, more importantly, the pauper she snapped her fingers at was a witness, along with the whole world, to exactly the kind of person she really was. And that's the thing I'd want you to take from this, if you take anything. Be very, very careful how you treat people you think are beneath you, because you have no idea who they really are, and, this is the part that matters even more, because how you treat the powerless is not a private matter. It is the truest possible advertisement of your character, and it is always, always being witnessed, and it always, eventually, comes home. The person you're cruel to today, thinking they can't touch you, may hold your whole future in their hands. But even if they don't, even if they truly are powerless, your cruelty to them is a case you are building against yourself, one that will eventually be read aloud. Bianca spent years building that case. It finally got read aloud at a birthday dinner, and the kindest, plainest, most unimportant man in the room turned out to be the one holding the verdict. So treat the waiter well. Treat the assistant well. Treat the plain old man in the corner well. Not because he might secretly own the building, though he might, but because it's who you should be, and because the world is always watching, and because the way you treat people who can't do anything for you is the only real measure of the person you are. So let me ask you something, and I do read these. Have you ever watched someone treat a nobody with contempt, never imagining who they were really dealing with, and watched it come back on them? Or have you ever been the underestimated one, dismissed by someone who had no idea who you really were? I'd truly like to know, because I've learned there's a quiet strength in being underestimated, and a quiet justice in how arrogance eventually meets itself, and I suspect many of you have lived one side of this or the other. And here's the one that matters most to me, and I ask it sincerely. Think of the people in your life who can do nothing for you. The servers, the clerks, the quiet elders, the ones the world overlooks. How do you treat them? Because I promise you that, not your title, not your clothes, not your status, is the truest measure of who you actually are. Be kind to them today, not because of who they might secretly be, but because of who it makes you. Tell me below about a time you saw someone's true character revealed by how they treated someone who couldn't help them. I'd be honored to hear it. That's all I've got tonight. If it meant something to you, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you at the next one.